The cold did not arrive all at once. It crept in, quiet and patient, the way death prefers to travel when it knows it has time. One moment, there was laughter in a small airplane, jokes bouncing between rows, dreams of a rugby match waiting at the end of the flight. The next moment, there was screaming metal, a violent tearing sound, and then silence so complete it felt like the world itself had stopped breathing. At more than 3,600 meters above sea level, in the heart of the Andes Mountains, 16 human beings would learn what survival truly demands. For 72 days, trapped in a frozen white tomb at -30 degrees Celsius, they would face a choice so extreme it still makes people look away. This is not a story about shock value. It is a story about hunger, loyalty, fear, faith, and the thin, terrifying line between civilization and survival. The plane had no business being there. A navigation error, a wall of cloud, and the sheer arrogance of assuming mountains would politely stay out of the way turned a routine flight into a disaster. When the aircraft struck the ridge, the impact ripped the wings clean off like paper. The fuselage skidded across snow and ice before slamming into a glacier and stopping abruptly. Seats tore loose, bodies flew. Some died instantly, others within minutes, pinned by wreckage or crushed by force no human body can tolerate. Those who survived the crash crawled out into a landscape that looked more like another planet than Earth. Endless white. No trees, no animals, no sign of help. Just ice, rock, and wind that screamed like something alive out in the first hours. Shock kept them warm. Adrenaline is a powerful liar. They pulled the injured from the wreckage. They used seat cushions as insulation. They tore fabric to make bandages. They whispered reassurances they didn't believe themselves. Night fell quickly, and with it came a cold that did not negotiate. At -30 degrees, the human body loses heat faster than thought. Breath crystallized. Fingers went numb. Every movement felt like breaking glass inside the joints. They huddled inside the torn fuselage, pressing together for warmth, listening to the wind batter the thin metal walls. Food existed, technically. A few chocolate bars, some wine, a handful of snacks meant for a short flight, not a siege. They rationed, immediately dividing crumbs with the seriousness of surgeons. Water had to be melted from snow, a task that burned precious energy. Each day the sun rose bright and merciless, reflecting off the snow so intensely it burned skin and eyes. Each night the temperature plunged again, and sleep came only in shivering fragments. Hope arrived through a small radio salvaged from the wreckage. For days they listened, straining to hear news of rescue. Search planes flew overhead, close enough that survivors screamed and waved, their voices stolen by wind and distance. White fuselage against white snow is nearly invisible. After more than a week, the words they feared finally crackled through the radio. The search had been called off. Officially, they were dead. That moment changed everything. Before, survival felt temporary, a matter of holding on until help arrived. Now survival became an open-ended problem with no promised solution. Hunger sharpened from discomfort into obsession. The body, denied calories, begins to eat itself. Fat goes first, then muscle. Thoughts slow, emotions flatten. People cry without knowing why. The idea of food becomes impossible to escape. They dreamed of meals in agonizing detail. They woke with the taste of bread in their mouths and nothing in their hands. The dead were still there, preserved by cold like statues. Friends, teammates, people with names, jokes, histories. No one spoke about them at first. The idea hovered, unspoken, heavy as the mountains themselves. Then someone said it quietly, almost apologetically. There was no plant life, no animals, no insects, nothing living to eat. Only human bodies, frozen solid by the cold. The moral shock was immediate and violent. Many felt physically ill at the suggestion. Others turned away, angry, offended. This was unthinkable. This was crossing a line you don't cross and remain human. But hunger does not respect philosophy. It is not impressed by values. It simply tightens, day after day, until it occupies every thought. People began to weaken so badly they could barely stand. Some developed frostbite. Infection spread. A few died from their injuries, quietly, slipping away in the night. Eventually, the conversation returned, no longer abstract. It was practical, grim, unavoidable. If they did nothing, they would all die. If they acted, some might live. The decision was not unanimous, and it was not made lightly. Many turned to faith, reframing the act not as violence, but as a gift. Those who had died could, in death, help the living survive. Consent was imagined, hoped for, prayed over. Tears were shed. Promises were made to families who were not there to hear them. When they finally ate, there was no frenzy, no madness. Just silence. Small pieces, eaten slowly, almost ceremonially. The taste was described later as neutral, unfamiliar but not monstrous. The real horror was psychological, not physical. Each bite carried weight. Each swallow forced them to confront what they had become and why. Some could not eat at first and nearly died because of it. Others forced themselves, understanding that refusal was another form of surrender. Days blurred together. Survival became routine in a strange, stripped-down way. Wake up, melt snow. Eat measured portions, tend wounds. Talk quietly to keep despair from growing too loud. They learned how to cut the frozen flesh with shards of metal. They learned how to dry it in the sun so it could be stored. These are facts that make people uncomfortable, but discomfort is a luxury reserved for the safe. Then the mountain reminded them who was truly in charge. An avalanche roared down in the night, smashing into the fuselage like a living wall. Snow buried everything. Several survivors were crushed or suffocated, trapped in darkness so complete they couldn't see their own hands. For days, those who remained alive were sealed inside an icy coffin, rationing air, whispering prayers, trying not to move too much. When they finally dug themselves out, the group was smaller, quieter, more fragile. At this point, something shifted. Waiting was no longer an option. Rescue was not coming to them. They would have to go to rescue. Two of the strongest survivors prepared for an impossible journey, crossing mountains they had been told were unclimbable in improvised clothing. With no map, no equipment, and bodies weakened by weeks of starvation. The others watched them leave, fully aware they might never be seen again. The trek was agony stretched across days. Thin air burned lungs. Snow swallowed legs with every step. At night, the cold threatened to stop hearts mid-beat. They slept sitting up, back to back, to avoid freezing. At one point, they reached a peak and saw, for the first time, green valleys in the distance. Civilization existed. Life existed. The mountains were not endless after all. When the two survivors finally encountered other humans, the moment was almost surreal. They were barely recognizable as people, gaunt, sunburned, wrapped in rags. Words had to bridge a gap between worlds that should not exist side by side. Rescue teams were mobilized immediately, helicopters fighting altitude and weather to reach the crash site. One by one, the remaining survivors were lifted from the ice, blinking in disbelief, alive in a way that felt almost illegal after so long surrounded by death. When the story reached the world, the reaction was predictable and divided. Some called them heroes. Others judged them harshly from warm rooms with full stomachs. Questions were asked, often without compassion. Could they have done something else? Was it justified? These questions miss the point. Ethics in extremis is not a classroom exercise. It is a negotiation with extinction. Survival is not noble or ugly by default. It is simply human. The survivors themselves carried the weight long. After the ice released them, nightmares, guilt, gratitude so intense it hurt. Many spoke openly, not to shock, but to explain. They emphasized what is easy to forget. No one was killed for food. Death came first, and only then did survival ask its terrible price. They spoke about community, about sharing equally, about refusing to let anyone be left behind even when bodies failed. This story endures because it forces an uncomfortable realization. Civilization is a thin layer we carry with us, but it is not indestructible. Strip away warmth, food, and rescue, and humans are still capable of cooperation, sacrifice, and meaning, even when forced into choices we would rather pretend do not exist. The Andes did not turn these people into monsters. They revealed something more unsettling and more powerful. How far a human being can go, not for cruelty, but for life. 72 days in a frozen wasteland ended with 16 survivors stepping back into the world. They did not come back unchanged, and they did not come back ashamed of surviving. They came back with a story written in ice, hunger, and willpower. A reminder that when everything familiar is stripped away, survival is not about strength alone. It is about the choices you make when there are no good options left. Only the choice to live or to disappear into the snow. The world they returned to wanted clean answers. Reporters wanted sound bites. Audiences wanted villains or saints. The survivors had neither to offer. What they carried back from the Andes was something far more complicated. A lived understanding of how fragile normal life really is, and how quickly certainty collapses when nature removes the safety rails. When the helicopters landed and the rotors scattered snow across the wreckage, several survivors reportedly felt panic rather than joy. For weeks, the crash site had become their entire universe. It was brutal, cruel, and lethal, but it was also familiar. Leaving it meant confronting questions they had managed to postpone. What would people say? How would families of the dead react? Could ordinary society even understand what had happened up there? Medical teams were shocked by their condition. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, frostbite that would leave permanent damage. Some survivors weighed barely more than children. Their bodies had adapted to starvation in ways doctors rarely see outside of famine zones. Recovery would take months, sometimes years. But physical healing was the simplest part. Psychologically, survival guilt ran deep. Why did I live when others didn't? Why did my body endure while theirs failed? These questions haunted quiet moments, especially at night. The dead were not abstractions. They were friends, brothers, teammates, faces replayed endlessly in memory. Laughter from before the crash echoed alongside the screams during it. Survival did not erase grief. It sharpened it. Public reaction soon forced the survivors into a defensive position. Once it became known how they had survived, rumors spread faster than facts. Some outlets sensationalized the story, stripping it of context, turning human desperation into grotesque spectacle. The word cannibalism was used without nuance, without explanation, without empathy. It triggered ancient taboos, primal disgust. For many observers, it was easier to condemn than to imagine themselves in the same position. The survivors responded by doing something unexpectedly brave. They spoke openly, calmly, without embellishment. They explained the conditions, the hunger, the lack of alternatives. They described the careful, equal distribution of food. They explained that no one was forced, that some waited days before they could bring themselves to eat, that prayers were said, that gratitude, not violence, defined the act. In doing so, they reframed the narrative from horror to humanity. Religious leaders weighed in as well. Many clarified that, within the framework of survival ethics and intention, what had been done was not a sin. This mattered deeply to the survivors, some of whom had leaned heavily on faith to endure the ordeal. Belief had given structure to chaos, meaning to suffering. It had helped transform an unthinkable act into a moral compromise rather than a moral collapse. Years later, survivors reflected on something outsiders often miss. Survival was not driven by selfishness. It was driven by cooperation. No one hoarded food. No one tried to gain advantage. Decisions were made collectively. Weakness was protected, not exploited. In conditions where social order usually disintegrates, there's intensified, rules formed. Roles emerged. Compassion survived alongside hunger. The Andes themselves played a silent but constant role. High-altitude cold preserves bodies in a way that is both merciful and cruel. The same temperatures that killed so efficiently also prevented decay, making survival possible at all. Nature was both executioner and reluctant accomplice. This paradox haunted survivors long after rescue. The mountains had tried to kill them repeatedly, yet also provided the conditions that allowed them to live. What makes this story endure decades later is not the shock of what they ate, it is the discipline with which they survived. In an age where survival is often framed as individual heroism, this was survival as community. No lone savior. No dramatic last-minute miracle. Just human beings making the least worst decisions available to them, day after freezing day. Psychologists studying extreme survival often point to this case as a powerful example of adaptive morality. Ethics do not vanish under pressure. They transform. What matters is intention, necessity, and respect for human dignity, even in its most damaged form. The survivors did not abandon morality. They renegotiated it under conditions no ethical system was designed to handle. Many of them went on to live full, meaningful lives. Some married, some had children. Some avoided public attention entirely, choosing quiet paths far from cameras. Others spoke at length, not because they enjoyed revisiting the trauma, but because they felt a responsibility. If their suffering could teach something about resilience, honesty, or humility, then it should not be wasted, and there is a lesson here, uncomfortable as it may be. Modern life trains us to believe that civilization is permanent, that supermarkets and heating and rescue systems are guaranteed. The Andes story reminds us that these things are recent inventions, fragile layers between us and the raw reality of nature. Take them away, and the human animal reappears not savage, but adaptive, capable of terrible choices and extraordinary solidarity at the same time. This is why the story resists simplification. It is not a tale of monsters or saints. It is a mirror held up to our own assumptions. We judge from warmth, from fullness, from safety. But survival stories like this ask a harder question, not what would you do, but what would you become when there is no other way? 72 days in frozen silence did not destroy their humanity. It exposed it under extreme pressure, stripped of comfort and illusion. The survivors did not return unchanged, but they returned with something rare, a lived understanding of how thin the line is between life and death, and how strong the human will can be when survival depends not on strength alone, but on cooperation, sacrifice, and the courage to endure the unendurable.